Yo, butt nuggets!
It's Team Bam versus Team Hawk in Tony Hawk's Underground 2. This time it's not just about skating, it's about mayhem. Tag it, slap it, thrash it, blast it on a totally underground, definitely illegal world destruction tour. Tony Hawk's Underground 2, rated T for Teen.
Yeah, look like my sister!
Following the success of the first Underground, Neversoft decided to lean even more heavily into the new direction it established and stray even further from the roots of the Pro Skater series. Now, if you were a longtime fan of the Tony Hawk games, I can easily see how you could take one look at Underground 2 and feel a little like Don Corleone.
Look how they massacred my boy.
If the first Underground was a skateboarding game that featured some elements from the action-adventure genre, then Underground 2 feels like an action-adventure game where your primary method of transportation just happens to be skateboarding. As the marketing made clear, less emphasis was being placed on busting out sick combos, with the focus instead shifting to pulling pranks and causing chaos. If your primary exposure to skate culture had come in the form of these games, then the heavy focus on Bam Margera and his merry band of misfits probably seemed weird and felt like Activision and Neversoft were just attempting to cash in on the popularity of Jackass. But given the history of stuff like Big Brother magazine and Bam's CKY video series, the partnership actually made a lot of sense. That being said, it did mean that the sophomore humor, which had always lurked in the background of these games, was now more prevalent than ever before. Because they were such gameplay-driven experiences, the first 4 Tony Hawk games had universal appeal. There had always been some juvenile comedy, but it was usually in the form of Easter eggs or other small stuff that could easily be ignored. By putting those aspects front and center, it did give Underground 2 a stronger identity, but it also meant it'd be far more divisive. I mean, if you're not a fan of the Jackass brand of humor, then stuff like the Wheel Loogies and the 10-year-old skating madman Paulie Ryan probably just made you roll your eyes with contempt. Neversoft wasn't exactly going for highbrow comedy.
Are you serious? You can't decide between me and a kid in a body cast?
But I was 9 when this game came out, so this type of stuff was gold to me at the time, and even now, I'll admit, it still gets a few chuckles out of me. Bam's cocky brashness was a great counterpart to Tony's laid-back zen persona, and the two play off one another really well. It's also just nice to see the Birdman take more of a starring role after his glorified cameo in the first Underground. Still, back when this game came out, I don't think I ever played through the story mode more than once, and that's mainly because a lot of the goals just kinda suck. Like, I might have bitched about having to spine transfer over the same object 10 times in a row in my look back at the first Underground, but stuff like hitting 5 NPCs with tomatoes isn't exactly what I was looking to replace it with. Others are centered more around exploration, such as having the player sticker slap all the cigarette vending machines in Berlin, or tag over graffiti, which can be found in all of the game's levels. While stuff like this had always been present, it was a lot less annoying in the Pro Skater days, when the levels were more compact, giving these challenges a far better flow. I mean, searching the levels in Underground 2 from top to bottom just to find that one tag you missed isn't the experience I'm looking for when I play a Tony Hawk game. And while the driving sections from the first Underground have thankfully been omitted, they've been replaced by special guest characters like Jesse James, who utilizes a pimped out Segway, and Steve-O's on a mechanical bull. While using these characters is more interesting than driving was in Underground 1, their movesets are extremely limited compared to the actual skaters, meaning they aren't nearly as fun to use. There just isn't enough focus placed on, actual skateboarding. Each level does have an arcade machine that has a high score you can beat, and you do get a handful of goals like pro lines or combo challenges, which fall more in line with the OG Tony Hawk formula everybody originally fell in love with, but they're too few and far between. The competitions, which have been included since the first Pro Skater, have also been completely removed, which is a damn shame because they were always some of the highlights in my opinion. Now, I think the best way to have handled this would have been to allow the player to choose whose team they wanted to be on, with Bam's being more focused on the Jackass-style antics, while Tony's placed more emphasis on skating, but obviously that would have nearly doubled the amount of cutscenes and voice work needed, and it's easy for me to make these suggestions with 19 years of hindsight, when I would have been the one who actually had to implement them. However, Neversoft were clearly aware that all their fans wouldn't be thrilled with the new direction they were taking the series, as they decided to have their cake and eat it too by introducing Classic Mode. Classic Mode is exactly what it sounds like, providing the old school Tony Hawk experience that gives you 2 minutes to chase after high scores and collect skate letters and secret tapes. All the levels from the story mode are playable, but the real cherry on top are the 6 levels from the first 3 games that were included and have been given reworked goals. The fact that half these levels were pulled from Pro Skater 3 was a bit disappointing at the time, as that game had been released on 6th generation consoles, and many people still likely had their copies on hand, but I'll never complain about having an excuse to tear up Canada one more time. The biggest highlights though were the inclusion of School 1 in Philadelphia. Aside from Xbox owners who had access to Pro Skater 2X, this was the first time most players had the ability to see these levels with revamped visuals, and they'd remain the definitive versions until the release of Pro Skater 1 and 2 16 years later. Not to mention the training level, which any longtime fan of the series will quickly recognize. Now, while I might not have ever revisited the story back in the day, I still put a ton of time into Free Skate and the various multiplayer offerings. The actual skating was the best it had ever been up to that point, but this was really due to all the work that had been done in the games leading up to Underground 2. With the biggest additions to the actual skating being the Nada spin, body flips, and focus mode, it was a pretty clear indicator that Neversoft had run out of ways to innovate and meaningfully expand upon the core gameplay. Still, when the core gameplay is this great, it doesn't matter all that much. Free Skate also allows the design of the new levels to really shine through, as they're just a lot more fun when you aren't constantly being forced into non-skating related activities. And you can't talk about a Tony Hawk game without mentioning the soundtrack, and Underground 2's is just as epic as we'd come to expect. It's incredibly diverse with acts like Iggy Pop, the Ramones, A$AP Rock, Atmosphere, Metallica, The Doors, Johnny Cash, and even Frank Sinatra all sharing time. If you have a narrow taste in music, then yeah, you're probably not gonna like every single selection, and you're free to remove whatever tracks you want from the in-game playlist. But as somebody who will listen to just about anything, I absolutely love it, and it's one of my favorites in the series, although I'll fully admit I usually end up saying the same thing about any of these games whenever I revisit them. At the end of the day, Underground 2 does feel somewhat like a title that was suffering from an identity crisis. With games becoming bigger and bigger and more arcadey experiences becoming less prevalent, it was obvious Neversoft was feeling pressure to try and keep up with the competition to keep the Tony Hawk series relevant during the 6th console generation, but many of the additions they made here feel unnecessary at best and at worst actively detract from the overall experience. Still, if you're willing to power through the 5 or so hours it takes to complete the story to unlock all the levels, then you'll find there's still a lot to love. I give Tony Hawk's Underground 2 9 big ol' loogies out of 12.